George, you and I have been to very many Mansion House speeches. When I first went to mine in 1997,
you ditched your black tie, didn't you?
We ditched our black tie.
No, you actually ditched the white tie and then didn't turn up in the black tie.
Well, no, I think the black tie had already replaced the white tie. It wasn't white tie in the final period of Ken Clarke. Gordon thought, though, if he said, I'm not going to wear black tie, that would mean nobody would wear black tie. And they all said, well, fine, if you don't want to, up to you, but all the rest of us are going to continue in black tie. So me and Terry Burns, Gus O'Donnell, we all had to arrive in lounge suits to support the Chancellor. We stood out like a sore thumb. They also had, at the time, had a thing called the Loving Cup. I mean, it's hard to imagine this now, especially in a post-COVID world, but there was this big, like a football trophy full of, I guess it was champagne, who knows what it was, and it was passed all the way around, hundreds of people, and everybody drank from the same cup. We all supped from this Loving Cup, and as you drank, you thought, what am I catching here?
That was the love affair between New Labour and the City, the culmination of the prawn cocktail offensive. We had a different version of the prawn cocktail offensive this week, didn't we? Because, for a Labour Chancellor a year into office, Rachel was making a big effort to woo financial services. I mean, this was really the first speech she's given, I think, since she's been in office, where she laid it on with a trowel about how important financial services were, how important banking was, and then unveiled, as you said in the introduction to this podcast, a set of reforms which she's calling the Leeds reforms, which I'm sure is only coincidental that she's a member of Parliament for Leeds, but a series of, I would say kind of sensible adjustment at the margins to the regulatory regime.
It's true. When you do something portentous, like saying the Leeds reforms, Jeremy Hunt talked about the Edinburgh reforms a couple of years ago. I think outside the experts, maybe you and me, I would say most people have no idea what the Edinburgh reforms were. If you think about Big Bang or Sarbanes-Oxley, you can think of what those reforms were. I certainly can. But were the reforms...
We should say Big Bang was the Nigel Lawson deregulation of the City, and Sarbanes-Oxley was the US regulation of banking, wasn't it?
Or Bretton Woods in 1944-45, the emergence of the new global economic order. These are all kind of labels which say an approach, a set of reforms. Do you think that what she announced will go down as, landmark? Will it be remembered? Will people talk about the Leeds reforms? Because I would say in the newspapers, the reception was, it wasn't hostile, but it was quite lukewarm. People aren't saying these are ambitious or risky, but maybe that's because they aren't hugely consequential.
I thought they were, as I said, sensible. I know the financial services team in the Treasury, led by a very capable civil servant, Gwyneth Nurse, I thought did a good job of saying, let's clip the wings of the financial ombudsman, who's got a bit big for their boots. Let's have a look at the capital requirements we put on challenger banks in Britain. Let's have a look at the senior managers regime, which was something I introduced. Let's reform ring fencing, but not replace it, which we discussed on this podcast previously. I mean, all of it is incremental, all of it perfectly solid stuff. Nothing radical, nothing revolutionary, nothing even approaching the Big Bang of Nigel Lawson. And you could say, well, maybe those things don't exist anymore. Maybe all the kind of heavy lifting has been done. I would say it's quite different from what is going on in the United States at the moment. And one of the guests at the Mansion House was the new head of the SEC, the American regulator, Hester Pierce. Hester Pierce and the Trump administration are passing pretty radical financial services legislation, particularly in the cryptocurrency stablecoin, which is a form of cryptocurrency, but unlike Bitcoin, it's backed by real-world currencies like dollars. And I think in the US, there's a pretty radical reform going on. And I would therefore, as always in politics, sometimes you need to notice the things that aren't happening rather than the things that are. And the speech that a Chancellor could have given, which would have been Britain's moving full on into this revolution. We want London to be the home of new digital financial services. We're going to see off the challenge that's emerging from Abu Dhabi and Dubai in this space to non-US jurisdictions like London. But you didn't really get anything. I mean, Rachel mentions stablecoins in passing, just saying we're going to move forward on it, but nothing of any note. And then you actually had Andrew Bailey saying this in his speech, because he also speaks on the night about stablecoins and digital currencies.
There's a lot of debate globally at the moment on the future of payments, both domestic and cross-border. Today, most payments are made from bank accounts in what we call commercial bank money. That's, in some ways, a statement of the blindingly obvious. What it does, though, is to tie payments directly to the creation of credit in the economy. Now, there is an urgent need, I think, for innovation in this area, and the opportunity is there, no doubt about that. There are other innovations. There may well be a role for stablecoins going forward, but I don't see them as a substitute for commercial bank money that creates credit in the economy. There may also be a role for retail central bank digital currency, but I have to be honest with you, I remain to be convinced why the natural next step needs to be to create a new form of money rather than put digital technology into retail payments and bank accounts.
Now, look, I have a very high regard for Andrew and appointed him when I was Chancellor to both the PRA, which is one of the regulators, and the FCA, which is the other financial services regulator. So I appointed him to two key jobs, and I think he's doing a good job as Governor of the Bank of England. I don't really understand, though, where Britain is on this crypto debate, and I should absolutely declare an interest here because I'm on the advisory board of Coinbase, which is one of the big companies in this space. But I joined that board because I'm interested in this, and I think there's a lot of potential future in it, even if there's risks. Britain is saying, or the Governor of the Bank of England is saying, he doesn't really see what these stable coins are for. And he's against, he said this in an interview with the Times as well at the beginning of the week, big banks issuing stable coins. Okay, fair enough. It's a perfectly respectable position. But the United States is literally, at the moment, passing a major law called the Genius Act, which is going to allow very large American banks to issue these stablecoins. And JP Morgan has just announced that they are going to. So they're the biggest bank in the world. And so Britain is deliberately deciding to not go along with this and essentially prevent or make it much harder for UK banks to do so. And at the same time, the European Central Bank, right, Christine Lagarde, who's president of that, has announced that it's issuing a central bank digital currency. And Andrew Bailey saying, I don't really see the point of doing that in Britain. Now, they may be, he would justify those as sensible, cautious steps. But the rest of the world is moving on. And it's another case, I think, of the UK, particularly in a sort of post-Brexit world where it can't influence some of these European decisions, essentially choosing to opt out of a big piece of innovation in financial services. And that is at a time when the Chancellor of the Exchequer in her Mansion House speech is reminding us all that financial services has been huge for the UK economy, is our largest single sector. And it's quite a it's quite a moment for the UK to say, we don't really want to be part of the next revolution.
I think if you are the Chancellor or the Governor of the Bank of England, you have to strike a balance between encouraging business and innovation and not taking what could turn out to be big systemic risks with the financial system. And I think one of the kind of questions for Rachel Reeves' speech was she taking big risks, which might have been exciting but also dangerous? And I think what she's done in her reforms are all sensible. I don't have any problems with them. I don't think she should have gone further on, for example, mandating pension funds to invest in certain kinds of British assets. And I think the ring fencing reforms done through a review that's the right approach, although I hope they will soften the ring fence because I think it's turning out to be quite anti-competitive. But there is a balance. And if they'd taken risky decisions, we would have been worrying about that as well as wondering how it will work. What is clear in the case of stablecoin and the wider crypto debate is that Andrew Bailey thinks that unchecked and unregulated, and let's be clear, part of the problem with the crypto world is people like it because it is outside the government's purview. It is unregulated. He thinks this could turn out to be a major risk to financial stability and also dupe individual savers and investors because you claim this is a kind of money, a stable coin, a token is a dollar, but there's no guarantee that would be the case. And his concerns are reflected by the Bank of International Settlements, the Committee of Central Bankers, the previous pre-Trump leadership of the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, shared those worries. I think there is a real question as to whether what these reforms end up doing is unleashing a new bout of financial instability and financial risk. What people say is happening.
But could I just say, isn't all of that might be true, or at least there's a risk of it. But there's a choice for the UK, which is, do you engage in something that's happening around you in order to mitigate it or adjust it or be part of the conversation about how it develops? Or are you really saying, look, we don't want any part of it? And isn't that a delusion that Britain can isolate itself from global financial markets and developments in financial services?
Well, look, I hope that's not what they do. Andrew Bailey is about to become the chair of the Financial Stability Forum. He is going to be the guy who is looking across the world in a leadership role at the direction of financial regulation. And I think what he is saying, and what the BIS are saying, is that unless you regulate this carefully and properly, the danger is that it becomes kind of wild and destabilizing. And it's not clear to me that the motive of US legislation is to get regulation right, as opposed to enable an unregulated, a more free market, free-for-all world. If you go back to the 19th century, there was a period between the 1830s and the 1860s where banks within individual states could issue their own dollars, which were underwritten by those banks within a very light touch state regulatory framework, and it led to wild durations in the values of those dollars. A dollar from one place didn't have the same value as a dollar from another place. It was quite destabilizing for firms who put their money into those dollars and turn out they weren't worth what they thought. And I think what Andrew and the BIS are saying is, unless you understand what you're doing here with stablecoin, the danger is you unleash that kind of instability and financial systemic risk. So are they saying
but
that
no one is, that message, is a bit after the fact, because the US Congress has just legislated, the US administration is moving forward, the Gulf is pushing forward, China is developing its own separate digital
and it's a dangerous
currency
game.
regime.
So what should we do? Should we say, well, okay, given that it's the Wild West, let's join the Wild West? Or do you say, hang on a sec, this has the potential to destabilize global financial markets, and we need to make sure we do this in a regulated way?
I think it's a big risk for the UK and financial services to miss out on major pieces of innovation, because that has been our history as a home of innovation.
Even if they're flawed.
Well, look, like any piece of innovation, it comes with, downsides as well as upsides. But the more you're part of the conversation, the more likely you are to be heard on how you mitigate this.
See, I just think the George Osborne who introduced ring fencing and higher capital controls and was worrying about the aftermath of the global financial crisis, I think you, as Chancellor, would have been more cautious and worried about this than George Osborne of 2025.
As Chancellor, I used a Bitcoin ATM on camera. The first Bitcoin ATM in Britain. It was in Canary Wharf, and I put in £10, took out some Bitcoin, and then made one of the bigger mistakes in my career, which was return to the Bitcoin after the camera was turned off, because for kind of for ethics reasons, it wasn't appropriate for me to keep the Bitcoin. If I had, I would have made a lot of money.
Well, you'd have made a lot of money, and then the value would have gyrated all the way wildly down, and then it would have come up again because...
Yeah, but real world currently, hold on, the dollar's gone down 10% in the last 3 months. And, there are shares, companies, there are major British companies whose share price is today half what it was 6-7 years ago. And others, of course, have doubled, or more. So, there are the idea that money itself doesn't change in value relative to other forms of money is itself, of course, a delusion. We're having this conversation in the week in which we just heard that UK inflation has gone up again to 3.6%. So the value of the pound is anyway, losing value relative to other assets.
That is true, but a dollar is a dollar at the moment. It can go up and down in value, but my dollar bill note and your dollar bill note is the same dollar. What the danger is in the stablecoin world, you give the impression that this is money you can rely upon, but it turns out not to be. People end up on that assumption getting involved in a whole bunch of kind of financial commitments they then can't deliver. And unless you do that in a regulated environment, the problem with crypto is by definition, people want it to be unregulated. But
it also reduces a lot of the middlemen and the costs of transactions and the inefficiencies
and the money laundering rules and the oversight, which means that very many people think that this is
you could argue a crypto transaction is easier to follow than a $20 bill. But listen, we could do a whole podcast on this.
We could. I'm just worried about it, and I'm not anti-crypto. I'm worried about it happening in a wildly unregulated fashion, and that is what America is now doing, which the SEC weren't before.
I guess I'm making a broader point about Britain trying to stay competitive, sure, and trying to earn a living in this world at a time when lots of people have a big question mark over the British economy. I think we should just turn, shouldn't we, to something that Rachel Reeves said in passing at the Mansion House speech about the government's record on the overall economy, which I think people listening to would have put a big question mark against. This is what she said.
When we came into this office, it was this government, that restored Britain's reputation as a beacon of stability by putting the public finances back on a firm footing, getting debt on a downward path, while investing prudently alongside business. That was, and still is, the right choice.
I wish what the Chancellor was saying was true, as someone who lives in this country, but I don't think around the world Britain is seen as a beacon of financial stability. And I don't think people think at the moment that this Labour government has got a grip on the public finances because of the events we've been talking about in this podcast over recent weeks, with the U-turns on welfare changes and this big looming question which hung over her speech to the city audience, which is, where are the tax rises coming? And is she going to tax wealth creation, business and enterprise in the autumn? And, I thought that was a little bit complacent to say that. I think you can say we're working at these things. It's a big task. It's the job's not yet done. But I don't know whether it was just, the way the speech was constructed, or she really thinks the job is done, because I don't think anyone else does.
I don't think she can possibly think the job is done. The headwinds are getting tougher on growth, disappointing, inflation a bit higher. Nobody looks at what's happening in the global economy and feels more confident at the moment. We discussed last week the scale of the tax rises which will be needed in the autumn. And the government's had a very confused week about what they mean by a working person, what the manifesto commitment really means in terms of who can and can't pay more tax when they come to the budget. And then we had the news today that as Parliament finishes for the summer, the government has just taken the whip away from 4 of the rebels, the most public of whom was Rachel Maskell, the York MP, who was involved in the welfare rebellion. But there was a real kind of tension here because
weren't they being a bit naive? I mean, I was listening to Rachel Maskell being interviewed on the Today programme this morning. I mean, she says, I've been in the Labour body for over 30 years. She's been voting against her government on 3 line whips, as has these other 3 MPs. It's done huge damage to the reputation of this government, that it's got a kind of grip on Parliament, it's got a big majority and get things done. I was talking, as it happens this week, to a major international investor, and they were saying, what a contrast between Trump and Starmer. Trump's got a tiny majority in Congress and has just passed what he calls his big, beautiful bill, which you may not like, but is full of tax cuts and spending increases and the like. And Starmer, with a majority of whatever it is, 170 odd, can't get his changes in fiscal policy through Parliament. So, I think if you're the Labour government, you do need to send a message to your supporters in Parliament. Hold on, this is not a free-for-all. We're a parliamentary party and we have to follow our 3 line whips.
Of course that's right, but you've also got to be consistent in your messaging. And they did a U-turn. They said they'd got it wrong. They said we're going to go away and listen and come back and do things differently. And then a week later, they take the whip away from 4 of the rebels. And, I mean, it's not quite clear what kind of listening that, I think taking trade jobs away from people who rebel makes sense. I think in Parliament...
they were a Gordon Brown invention, weren't they, to increase the number of jobs that he could hand out?
I guess so. But although I don't
they were very useful to subsequent Tory prime ministers.
But I think... but taking the whip away from people who a week ago you conceded to is quite confusing. You turn Rachel Maskell into a martyr. I'm just not sure how wise this is. It may be that people in Downing Street said, we've made threats to people and now we've got to follow through. Although if you're going to follow through, you follow through at the time. You don't follow through a week later. I think it's quite confusing and quite messy. There'll be some people who think, as you do, good on them, finally a bit of discipline. But the truth is that, I'm not sure it clears up the mess.
I thought some of them have voted against the government on other issues like planning reforms and the like. I mean, I do think the number 10 has to, on the domestic front, restore a sense that it has control, that there is a plan.
How many times did you and David Cameron take the whip away from people? I seem to remember there being over 100 Conservatives who voted against you on that referendum bill in 2011. You didn't take the whip away. Tony Blair and Gordon Brown didn't take the whip away. The first time that really happened in a big time way was Boris Johnson, and look what happened to him. I'm just not sure if this is wise politics.
No, we never. I mean, the John Major, we were talking about him earlier. Of course, he took the whip away from the Maastricht rebels and in the process eliminated his own majority. And yes, I mean, Boris Johnson knifed Ken Clarke and Philip Hammond and so on. I don't think we ever took the whip away for simply voting against the government. What we said to people is,
Blair or Brain.
What we simply said is, you're going to be on the back benches for the rest of the Parliament.
Fair enough.
You're not going to get into the government.
I'm just not sure whether in the end this is wise parliamentary handling, and but we will see. Yeah. We should move on because we need to talk about the arrival of the German Chancellor, Mr. Merz, into London today, and in the context of what Britain and France have agreed on nuclear weapons a week ago. So last week on the podcast, we discussed the hugely important agreement between France and the UK, announced by Prime Minister Keir Starmer, President Macron, around a one-in, one-out returns deal for migrants. But that wasn't the only major agreement which was discussed at the summit. They also came out with what they called the Northwood Declaration, which is a deepening of cooperation between the UK and France in their use and management and coordination of their independent nuclear deterrents. And with the arrival into town today of German Chancellor Merz, this again is going to be on the agenda for discussion. This is what Keir Starmer said about that agreement at his press conference.
This morning, we signed the Northwood Declaration, confirming for the first time that we are coordinating our independent nuclear deterrents. From today, our adversaries will know that any extreme threat to this continent would prompt a response from our two nations. There is no greater demonstration of the importance of this relationship.
So we have talked before about how the Donald Trump presidency is kind of throwing into doubt assumptions which have shaped the whole post-war era in terms of both the economy and a commitment to free trade or open trade, but also to security. The recent NATO summit, Donald Trump ended up going away having, I would say, reaffirmed American support to NATO and the kind of Article 5 mutual dependency of all the NATO members. But this agreement between France and the UK in this declaration, with no reference to the United States, is a sign that things are changing. That you have to think about how defence in Europe would function, and in particular the independent nuclear deterrence, in a world where America is becoming less engaged, potentially less reliable, certainly where you couldn't assume that a Trump presidency would be there if Article 5 was being invoked?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of interesting observations here. First of all, for a German Chancellor to come to Britain to sign a defence deal is pretty extraordinary. It's actually the first time it's happened since the Second World War. So it is a major, major step forward, not so much in terms of this country's defence, but in terms of Germany's attitude to defence, post-war Germany's attitude to defence. And of course sits alongside the major reforms that Friedrich Merz is making to the fiscal rules, essentially, in Germany, changing the constitution and spending a whole lot more money on defence. Second, on the kind of French cooperation, I think if you listen very carefully to what Keir Starmer is saying, he's saying we confirm for the first time. He's not saying we are for the first time cooperating. He's merely confirming what was already happening, which was that there is quite a lot of cooperation already between France and Britain on their nuclear deterrence. And this is actually a relatively recent thing in the history of this. So if you look at the post-war history of developing nuclear weapons, obviously the United States, used the atomic bomb in Japan, and then there was the decision of the Attlee government and the de Gaulle governments in Britain and France to develop their own nuclear weapons. But in the 1960s, basically Britain decided it couldn't afford anymore to go it alone. It had to work with the Americans on developing these nuclear weapons, particularly the missiles. They tried to develop their own British missiles and failed, and John F. Kennedy and Harold Macmillan did a deal. And that's the state of the British deterrent to this day. The French deterrent was always separate, and the French deterrent didn't rely on the US and didn't rely on Britain. And that has all been the case until quite recently, and then suddenly, I think partly driven by the sheer cost for France of trying to sustain this system entirely independently, there has been more cooperation, not just with Britain, but also with the US. And so I think what you're getting today is really a sort of statement of reality, which is cooperation is already happening. And I thought the final thing I'd observe in this space is, we're very focused because of Brexit and everything on the European Union. We were just talking earlier about money and the Eurozone and the European Central Bank. When it comes to defence, Britain is absolutely at the heart of European cooperation. There may be sort of parts of the EU which are supposed to be sort of defence and foreign policy agreements, but I wouldn't say they're meaningless, but they don't have much force if Britain's not engaged because of the size and importance of our military forces and the existence of this independent nuclear deterrent, or semi-independent deterrent using American technology. And it's so interesting that, as Brexit was not the last word on Britain's relationship with Europe, and it's in this defence space which we're being pushed back centre stage, partly because of real world things like Ukraine and Russia's aggression, and partly because of events in the United States with the Trump administration. That's right,
but the arrival of Merz today, though, kind of makes this more acute, because if America is a less reliable ally, and the recent defence review, there was a really good article by Lawrence Friedman, the defence expert, on Substack this week, where he quotes the recent defence review, with the US clear that the security of Europe is no longer its primary international focus. US and European allies must step up their efforts. So if the US is pulling away, France has always kept its kind of nuclear capability outside the sort of NATO coordination. Britain has always been kind of not only central to the NATO process, but wanting to make sure that it didn't in some Gaullist way think about a world without America. But maybe that is the world we're in. Suddenly, from a Germany point of view, if you aren't sure that the American umbrella is really reliable, then suddenly what the commitment of Britain and France to collective European defence is becomes much more acute. And, in the use of nuclear weapons and independent deterrence, it's partly about capability. Have you got the capability? So from a German leader's point of view, do France and Britain actually have the nuclear capacity if America's not engaged? But then secondly, it's about resolve and how decisions are made. And can Germany and other European countries rely upon France or Britain to be there if needed, if there was some kind of Putin incursion which threatened nuclear weapons on the eastern border of Europe. So for Germany, it becomes a question, can you rely upon Britain and France to be there when you need them? That is a European conversation.
I mean, it'd be interesting to see whether in German politics over the next 10, 20 years, they start to discuss whether they want to develop their own nuclear deterrents. I mean,
legally very complicated for Germany constitutionally.
Yes, but Japan, which is, of course, was the, on the receiving end of the only time nuclear weapons have ever been used, now quite explicitly says it has the capacity in very short order to build a nuclear weapon. So it doesn't have one assembled, but it can. And I wonder whether Germany will move in that direction. Poland has already indicated that it's thinking of doing that, because in the current environment, you are constantly reminded that nuclear weapons do provide you with that kind of additional layer of defense. I mean, that's what we've of course been discussing on this podcast why Israel took out, with American help, the Iranian nuclear deterrent. I remember when we had a discussion in the coalition government about the cost of replacing the Trident submarines. Unbelievably expensive. I think it will cost over £100 billion probably, this program, once it's finished. And we looked at alternatives. The then cabinet secretary, now sadly deceased, Jeremy Hayward, conducted a review of kind of potential other options, such as cruise-based nuclear weapons and so on. Where did you have to have these submarines that fire these ballistic missiles into space and then, can land in cities on the other side of the world? And he concluded, that was required. The coalition concluded it was required. And I had a very interesting dinner once when I was actually the shadow chancellor I was in Cornwall, and I had dinner with John Knott, who's now also sadly deceased. And he was Margaret Thatcher's defence secretary.
During the Falklands War?
Yeah, and he had commissioned...
Famously stormed out of a Newsnight interview with Robin Day, I think it was.
As a here today, gone to tomorrow politician. That's what Robin Day had accused him of. And he had replaced the Polaris submarines with the Trident submarines, and that was a really expensive commitment at the time. And I said to him, do we really need these incredibly expensive submarines? And surely if you can just have some sort of cheaper, smaller nuclear weapons, that in itself is a deterrent. And he said, you have to be able to convince your enemy that whatever they do, whatever they throw at you, you will be able to hit back. And because these submarines could be anywhere in the world, and these missiles are uninterceptable once they're on their way. That's why you need it. And he said, look...
Doesn't mean you have to have the same number of warheads as your enemy. You just have to be able to always hit them hard.
Whatever they do, even if they try and preemptively strike you. And I remember him saying to me at this dinner, it was around the table in his house in Cornwall. He said it is 1% of Britain's budget, and you've got to think overall government budget, and you've got to think of it as an insurance policy. Something you'll never probably have to need. The kind of thing that if you didn't have in a catastrophe, let's imagine a Russian invasion into Europe, the United States totally detached, not wanting to get involved, as it didn't the last time there was a conflict in Europe and the time before, both Second World Wars, it took a long time for the United States to get involved. Would you not regret the decision you'd taken years earlier to give up on this capability?
And you concluded there was not, when you were Chancellor, a cheaper way to do it.
I basically bought into the argument, and I was quite sceptical. Well, certainly I was not sceptical, but I was very open-minded to alternatives. And I kind of came to the conclusion, I think this is the only thing that absolutely guarantees you have a deterrent. A deterrent in the true sense, which is your opponent thinks there's nothing they can do that would ultimately stop you using it if you had to.
And absent America, is the French and British deterrents, are they deterrent enough? Do they pass that test?
Yeah, they're very similar. Both countries have 4 submarines. These are very expensive things to build, right? If you think of them, they're about the size of an aircraft carrier. They're underwater. They have to stay completely undetected. You have to have people living in them and, not being radiated by the nuclear weapons and the nuclear reactor that powers them. You have to be able to launch missiles into space that then come back into Earth and hit targets. You have to make sure that when they receive the instruction from the British Prime Minister or the French President, that's not a fake instruction or someone hasn't kind of somehow garbled the communications. They have to be able to fight off another submarine trying to attack them. I mean, they're really expensive and complicated things to build, of which, almost no one in the world can do it. And we're one of my kind of great theories about geopolitics is that Britain and France are so similar, same size countries in terms of population, GDP, same kind of history of, empire in the world and, at the heart of kind of the development of Western Europe, same military presence in the world, same sort of diplomatic reach around the world. And yet we always sort of rub up against each other, partly because we're sort of like twins. And I think it's a very good recognition by Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, and David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy before him, when they first started this defence agreement. And in fact, back, I think in the Brown Sarkozy era, that there's a lot we need to do together in the world.
However, the way in which that rubbing up together was mediated was also by the role of the Germans and others in the European Union. We're outside the European Union now. We have a bilateral deal with France. We're talking about a bilateral agreement with Germany. But actually, it's the conversation between France, Germany and Britain together which you really need to know how you'd respond to threats and to give a reassurance to non-nuclear powers in Europe. And I would guess at the moment a collective conversation outside of NATO between France, Germany and Britain together is still quite hard to do when it comes to the nuclear guarantee.
Yeah, but I think Germany is actually the hardest of those three. I remember we had a discussion, again, when we were in office, about whether Airbus should merge with BAE Systems, the big British defence company, and create a kind of European super defence company. And the French were in favour of it, the British were in favour of it, and it was the Germans who said no and blocked it at the time. And I think it was a foolish decision back then, but foolish for Germany as well. And maybe Germany is changing very, very rapidly. And so the most interesting, I come back to sort of my first observation here, that the most interesting thing of all this that's been announced is not really the sort of British-French cooperation, because that's been going on. It's as you say, that Germany understands it needs to lean in, and it can't, quite understandably, since 1945, it has basically checked out of defence because of its history. Now it needs to check back in.
I kind of think it's almost the other way around. Merz is saying, I'm the one who's now doing much more than any of you to increase our domestic defence capability, but we want to have a conversation with you about the capabilities we don't have that you have. So in some ways they're forcing themselves into this conversation now rather than the other way around. Very interesting. It does surprise me. If you think back to the 1980s when we were growing up, the Cold War, there was a huge conversation about disarmament, about multilateral disarmament. Thatcher, Reagan, the Reykjavik summit with Gorbachev. We now have nuclear weapon conversations about Iran. Who knows what's going on in North Korea. India and Pakistan kind of, at loggerheads. We're worrying about Putin, but nobody's talking about disarmament. It's sort of off the agenda.
It's such a good observation. Yes. So you've got a Labour government. It was a Labour government that commissioned Britain's first nuclear bomb, and now you've got a Labour government doing nuclear agreements with France and saying that we're going to develop a new class of nuclear weapons that can be used off bombers, fighter jets,
with no parallel conversation about multilateral disarmament.
So why is the Parliamentary Labour Party up in arms about disability benefits, and you can't hit, and the Labour Party I grew up with observing, the battle with CND inside the Labour Party was a big deal for the Neil Kinnocks of this world.
It was.
Why is it there's not a squeak?
Because it's a dangerous world.
It was a pretty dangerous world in the 1980s,
maybe,
I seem to remember.
Maybe people think it's a more dangerous world. I don't know the answer to that. But it's true, isn't it?
Yeah.
I wonder, we've often wondered, what will Donald Trump do next? The peacemaker Trump. He's not making much progress on his peacemaking initiatives. Maybe he'll suddenly become
the Nobel Prize.
Maybe he'll become the champion in a Reagan-style way of multilateral disarmament. Who knows?